I am sitting in a dimly lit room, the shadows casting long, haunting shapes that seem to mirror the weight of my years. At this moment, I find myself at the lowest point in my life, grappling with a pain that feels insurmountable. It's not just the physical pain that has become a constant companion, it's the emotional ache that has festered within me, a culmination of years spent feeling unheard, overlooked, and utterly invisible. The world outside continues to move, but here I am, trapped in my own silence, a ghost of the woman I once was. I can still hear the words of my doctor echoing in my mind, a dismissive remark that cut deeper than any blade ever could. "It's just drama," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. In that moment, I felt the fire ignite within me, a surge of indignation that pushed me to question how someone could so easily disregard my suffering. How could he, a man sworn to heal, so flippantly brush aside the reality of my pain? I was not a dramatist seeking attention. I was a woman desperate for understanding, yearning for someone to validate my existence. Before I continue, I want to connect with you, my audience. Please tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to know how far my story reaches and how many of you might resonate with this journey of pain and resilience. As I sit here, I can't help but reflect on the tapestry of my life, woven with threads of sorrow and moments of fleeting joy. The injustices I faced weren't just medical, they were deeply personal, rooted in my very being. I think back to my childhood, a time when I longed for the warmth of a mother's embrace, but instead was met with the coldness of her preoccupations. My mother was always there, yet she was never truly present. The clatter of dishes in the kitchen, the muffled conversations with friends on the phone, and the distant sounds of laughter from the living room felt like a cruel reminder of my isolation. I was a mere shadow in my own home, an afterthought in the lives of those who were supposed to care for me. I remember the day I learned to ride a bike, a rite of passage for many children. I had practiced for weeks, my heart racing with anticipation. I wanted my mother to cheer me on, to witness my triumph. But when the moment arrived, she was too busy with her own struggles, her own battles, to notice my small victory. I fell, scraped my knee, and cried, not just from the pain, but from the realization that my achievements went unnoticed. In that instant, I understood that I was invisible, a mere footnote in the story of my family. As I grew older, I sought validation from friends, hoping they would fill the void my mother's absence had created. But time and again, I was met with rejection. I remember sitting alone at lunch, watching as groups of girls laughed and shared secrets, their camaraderie a stark contrast to my solitude. I would muster the courage to approach them, only to be met with polite smiles that never reached their eyes. I began to internalize the message that I was unworthy of connection, a belief that would haunt me for years to come. It was during my teenage years that I first felt the pangs of true abandonment. My father, who had always been a distant figure, finally left. The day he walked out, I felt as if the ground beneath me had crumbled. I stood there, frozen, as he packed his things, the finality of his departure crashing over me like a tidal wave. "You'll be fine," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. I wanted to scream, to beg him to stay, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I watched him go, a part of me dying with him. In the years that followed, I tried to fill the void with relationships, friendships, and even fleeting romances. But each time, I found myself back in that familiar place of loneliness. It was as if I were wearing a mask, pretending to be someone I wasn't, all in a desperate attempt to be seen. I poured my heart into my work, seeking refuge in my career, hoping that success would validate my existence. But even as I climbed the corporate ladder, I felt the weight of my past creeping in, reminding me that no amount of achievement could fill the void of love and acceptance I had always craved. I often found myself reflecting on those moments of injustice, the times when my voice was silenced and my story went untold. I realized that my pain was valid, that it deserved to be acknowledged. But the struggle to be heard persisted, even in adulthood. I would go to doctors seeking answers for the physical ailments that plagued me, only to be met with skepticism and dismissal. "It's just stress," they would say, as if my body's cries for help were mere figments of my imagination. Each visit chipped away at my spirit, leaving me feeling more invisible than ever. And then there was that fateful day when I found myself in front of my doctor, the one who would dismiss my pain as mere drama. I had gone in with a list of symptoms that had plagued me for months: fatigue that felt insurmountable, joint pain that made even the simplest tasks feel like climbing a mountain, and a heaviness in my chest that wouldn't lift. I had hoped he would listen, that he would take my concerns seriously. But instead, he leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, and uttered those words that would haunt me for years to come. In that moment, I felt the walls closing in around me, the air thick with disbelief. I wanted to scream, to throw something at him, to make him understand the depth of my suffering, but all I could do was nod, a hollow acceptance of the fact that once again my pain had been minimized. I left his office feeling defeated, a familiar ache settling in my chest as I realized that I was still invisible, still unheard. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself spiraling deeper into despair. I stopped reaching out to friends, stopped sharing my struggles, convinced that no one would understand. I became a recluse, spending my days in solitude, surrounded by the echoes of my own thoughts. I felt trapped in a cycle of pain and isolation, each day a battle to find the strength to keep going. I longed for connection, for someone to see me, to truly see me, but I felt like a ghost haunting the edges of my own life. But then, something shifted. One evening, as I was sorting through old boxes in my attic, I stumbled upon a dusty, forgotten chest. It was small and unassuming, but something about it tugged at my heartstrings. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of me. As I opened the lid, a wave of nostalgia washed over me, and I was greeted with a treasure trove of memories: old letters, photographs, and trinkets from my childhood. Each item held a story, a piece of my past that I had long buried beneath the weight of my present. As I sifted through the contents, I felt a flicker of hope ignite within me. Perhaps this was the key to understanding my pain, to unearthing the roots of my abandonment and invisibility. I began to read the letters, each one a window into my mother's world, a world I had never truly understood. There were letters filled with dreams and aspirations, but also ones that revealed her struggles, her own battles with pain and loneliness. With each word, I felt a growing connection to her, a realization that her distance had not been a reflection of my worth, but rather a manifestation of her own struggles. I found myself immersed in this journey of discovery, piecing together the fragments of my family's history. The more I learned, the more I began to understand the complexities of our relationships, the intricate web of pain and love that had shaped us. I was no longer just a passive observer in my own life. I was an active participant, reclaiming my narrative. As I delved deeper into my mother's letters, I uncovered secrets that had long been buried. I learned about her dreams, her fears, and the sacrifices she had made. I discovered that she had faced her own battles with abandonment, her own moments of feeling unseen and unheard. The realization that we shared this common thread of pain filled me with a sense of solidarity, a connection that transcended the years. But with each revelation came a wave of emotions: anger, sadness, and a longing for the relationship I had always craved. I felt a growing tension within me, a need to confront my past and demand the validation I had been denied for so long. I realized that I had the power to rewrite my story, to break free from the cycle of pain that had held me captive for far too long. The journey wasn't easy, but I felt a newfound sense of determination. I began to reach out to those I had distanced myself from, sharing my struggles and opening up about my pain. I found solace in the connections I formed, the understanding that blossomed as I allowed others to see me for who I truly was. I was no longer invisible. I was a woman reclaiming her voice, her story. And then came the day when I decided to confront my doctor, the man who had dismissed my pain as mere drama. Armed with the knowledge I had gained from my mother's letters and my own journey of self-discovery, I walked into his office with a sense of purpose. I wouldn't let him silence me again. I was ready to demand the validation I deserved. As I faced him, I could feel the weight of my past lifting, replaced by a newfound strength. I spoke with conviction, sharing my journey, my pain, and the revelations I had uncovered. I could see the surprise in his eyes as I laid bare the truth of my experiences. For the first time, I felt seen, truly seen, and it was liberating. In that moment, I realized that my story was not just mine. It was a testament to the resilience of women like me, women who have been silenced, overlooked, and dismissed. I had transformed my pain into power, and I was ready to embrace the possibility of healing and a new beginning. As I left his office, I felt a sense of hope wash over me. I had reclaimed my voice, and with it, the promise of a brighter future. I was ready to share my story, to connect with others who might resonate with my journey, and to remind them that they, too, are worthy of being seen and heard. If my journey has touched you, I encourage you to subscribe to the channel and share it so that more people never give up on hope. Together, we can create a community of understanding and support where no one has to feel invisible again. I often find myself reflecting on the moments that shaped me, the moments that left indelible marks on my heart. The feeling of abandonment, of being unseen, has been a constant companion throughout my life. It is a shadow that lingers, whispering doubts and fears into my ear, reminding me of the times I felt like a ghost in my own existence. I remember the first time I felt that ache of invisibility, a pang that has echoed through the years, deepening with each passing moment of neglect. My childhood home was filled with echoes of laughter and warmth, but I often felt like an outsider looking in. My mother was a woman of strong will, but she was also a woman burdened by her own demons. I can still see her sitting at the kitchen table, her head buried in her hands, tears streaming down her face. She was fighting battles I couldn't comprehend, and in her struggle, I became a casualty. I longed for her to notice me, to wrap me in her arms and tell me that everything would be all right. But those moments were rare, and I learned early on that silence was the language of our household. I remember the days when my friends would come over to play, their laughter filling the air, while I sat on the sidelines longing to join them. I was always the one left out, the one whose invitations seemed to get lost in the shuffle. I would watch them from the window, my heart aching with a longing to belong. I often wondered if they could see the loneliness that enveloped me like a heavy cloak. It was a feeling that grew more profound as I aged, a constant reminder that I was never quite enough. School was no refuge either. I was the quiet girl in the back of the classroom, blending into the wallpaper. Teachers would call on me, but their words felt like a distant echo, never quite reaching my heart. I remember one particular incident vividly. A teacher had asked me a question, and when I hesitated to answer, she rolled her eyes and moved on to the next student. The laughter of my classmates rang in my ears as I shrank further into my seat, wishing the ground would swallow me whole. That moment solidified my belief that my voice didn't matter, that my pain was inconsequential. As I grew into my teenage years, the feelings of abandonment deepened. I watched as my friends formed tight-knit groups, sharing secrets and dreams, while I stood on the periphery, longing for connection. I would often go home after school, feeling the weight of rejection pressing down on me. I remember one particular evening when I sat on my bed, surrounded by the silence of my room, tears streaming down my cheeks. I felt invisible, as if I were a mere shadow in a world filled with vibrant colors. I wanted to scream, to shout that I was here, that I mattered, but the words caught in my throat. It was during these formative years that I began to internalize the message that my feelings were not valid. I learned to suppress my emotions, to hide my pain behind a facade of strength. I became a master at pretending, at putting on a brave face for the world while my heart ached in silence. I remember a family gathering where I was asked how I was doing. I smiled and said, "I'm fine," even though inside I felt like I was crumbling. The truth was that I was drowning in a sea of loneliness, and no one seemed to notice. As I transitioned into adulthood, the scars of my past continued to shape my experiences. I entered relationships hoping to find solace, but the cycle of abandonment seemed to follow me. I often found myself in partnerships where my voice was drowned out, where my needs were overlooked. I remember one relationship in particular where I poured my heart out to my partner, sharing my struggles and fears. Instead of understanding, I was met with indifference. "You're being dramatic," he said dismissively, as if my pain were an inconvenience. Those words echoed in my mind, reinforcing the belief that I was unworthy of being heard. It wasn't until I found myself sitting in that doctor's office, feeling the weight of my years pressing down on me, that I truly began to confront the injustices I had faced. I had gone in seeking answers for the pain that had become my constant companion, only to be met with dismissal. "It's just drama," he said, and in that moment, I felt the familiar sting of rejection. I was back in that classroom, back in my childhood home, where my feelings had always been minimized. But this time, something inside me shifted. I refused to let his words define me. As I left the office that day, I felt a fire igniting within me. I was determined to reclaim my story, to confront the injustices of my past. I began to dig deeper into my memories, unearthing the moments that had shaped my understanding of pain and abandonment. Each recollection was like a thread weaving together the tapestry of my life. I found myself reflecting on the times I had been overlooked, the moments when my voice had been silenced. I thought about my mother, the woman who had fought her battles in silence. I realized that her struggles were not so different from my own. She had faced her demons, and in her struggle, she had inadvertently taught me to suppress my emotions. I began to understand that her pain had been a reflection of her own experiences of abandonment, a cycle that had been passed down through generations. I felt a sense of empathy growing within me, a connection to the woman who had given me life. As I continued to explore my past, I stumbled upon the memories of my childhood home. The walls that had once felt so confining began to take on new meaning. I remembered the times I had sat in my room, feeling invisible, and I realized that those moments had shaped my understanding of love and acceptance. I had learned to seek validation from others, to measure my worth by their approval. But now, I knew that I had to break free from that cycle. I had to learn to validate myself, to acknowledge my own pain and struggles. The more I reflected, the more I began to uncover the layers of my story. I remembered the times I had been dismissed, the moments when my feelings had been brushed aside. I recalled the times I had felt invisible, as if my very existence was a burden. Each memory was a reminder of the injustices I had faced, but they also served as a catalyst for change. I realized that I had the power to rewrite my narrative, to reclaim my voice and my story. As I continued my journey of self-discovery, I began to reach out to those I had distanced myself from. I opened up about my struggles, sharing my experiences with friends and family. To my surprise, I found that they were more understanding than I had anticipated. I began to form connections based on honesty and vulnerability, and in those moments, I felt a sense of belonging that had eluded me for so long. I was no longer invisible. I was a woman reclaiming her identity. But even as I began to find my voice, the pain of my past lingered. I still felt the weight of abandonment pressing down on me, and I knew that I had to confront the source of that pain. I began to seek therapy, hoping to unravel the complexities of my emotions. In those sessions, I found a safe space to explore my feelings, to confront the injustices I had faced. I learned that it was okay to feel pain, that my emotions were valid and deserving of acknowledgement. As I sat in those therapy sessions, I began to peel back the layers of my past. I confronted the moments of rejection, the times when my voice had been silenced. I shared my experiences of feeling invisible, and with each revelation, I felt a sense of liberation. I was no longer bound by the chains of my past. I was breaking free, piece by piece. It was during one of those sessions that I first spoke about my experience with the doctor who had dismissed my pain. I could feel the anger rising within me as I recounted the moment he had labeled my suffering as drama. My therapist listened intently, validating my feelings and encouraging me to confront that moment head on. "You deserve to be heard," she said, her words resonating deep within me. I realized that I had been silenced for far too long, and it was time to reclaim my narrative. With each session, I grew stronger, more determined to confront the injustices that had plagued my life. I began to envision a future where my voice mattered, where I could share my story without fear of judgment. I started to write, pouring my heart onto the pages as I chronicled my journey of pain and healing. It was cathartic, a release that allowed me to confront my emotions head on. As I continued to explore my past, I stumbled upon an old box in my attic filled with letters and photographs that belonged to my mother. The discovery sent a shiver down my spine, a mix of excitement and trepidation. I carefully opened the box, revealing a treasure trove of memories that had been hidden away for far too long. Each letter was a glimpse into her world, a window into the struggles she had faced. As I sifted through the contents, I felt a connection to my mother that I had never experienced before. I read her words, her hopes and dreams, and I began to understand the complexity of her pain. She had fought her battles in silence, just as I had, and in those moments I felt a sense of solidarity with her. I realized that we were both women shaped by our experiences, both longing for validation and connection. With each letter I read, I uncovered the truth about my mother's struggles. She had faced abandonment in her own life, and her emotional distance had been a defense mechanism. I felt a wave of empathy wash over me as I began to understand the reasons behind her actions. She had been fighting her own battles, and in her struggle, she had unintentionally passed down the cycle of pain. As I pieced together the fragments of her life, I felt a growing connection to her. I realized that I had inherited her strength, her resilience, and that I had the power to break free from the cycle of silence. I began to confront my own struggles, to acknowledge the pain that had been buried for so long. I was no longer a victim of my circumstances. I was a survivor, ready to reclaim my voice. In those moments of discovery, I felt a surge of hope. I was no longer defined by my past. I was rewriting my narrative, one letter at a time. I knew that I had the power to confront my doctor, to demand the validation I had been denied for so long. I was ready to stand up for myself, to reclaim my story and my worth. As I prepared for that confrontation, I felt a mix of emotions: nervousness, anger, and a sense of determination. I was ready to face the man who had dismissed my pain, to show him that I was more than just a label. I was a woman with a story, a woman deserving of being heard. I could feel the weight of my past lifting, replaced by the promise of a brighter future. And so I began to gather my thoughts, to prepare for the moment when I would finally confront my doctor. I was ready to demand the validation I deserved, to reclaim my voice and my story. No longer would I allow anyone to silence me again. I was a woman on a mission, ready to embrace the possibility of healing and a new beginning. As I sat there, surrounded by the letters and photographs that had once belonged to my mother, I felt a mixture of emotions swirling within me. The box had become a sacred space, a portal to a past that had been shrouded in mystery for far too long. Each letter I pulled out was like a whisper from her, echoing the struggles she had faced, the dreams she had held on to, and the pain that had shaped her life. It was as if she were reaching out to me, urging me to understand her, to see her not just as my mother, but as a woman who had endured her own battles. I placed the first letter on my lap, the yellowed paper fragile beneath my fingers. It was dated years before I was born, and as I read her words, I could feel the weight of her longing and despair. "I feel so alone," she had written. "Sometimes it feels as if the world has forgotten me. I wish I could be the mother I want to be." My heart ached at her vulnerability, at the realization that the emotional distance I had felt all my life was not a reflection of my worth, but rather a consequence of her own struggles. With every letter, I felt as though I was peeling back the layers of not just her life, but my own. The pain she had endured was mirrored in my own experiences. I remembered the times I had sat in silence, feeling invisible, wishing for someone to see me, to hear my voice. It was as if we were two women, separated by time, yet united in our shared longing for connection. As I continued to read, I stumbled upon a photograph tucked away in the corner of the box. It was a picture of my mother standing in front of a modest home, a young woman with bright eyes and a hopeful smile. She looked so full of life, so different from the woman I had known. "This was before everything changed," I whispered to myself, tracing her face with my finger. I could almost hear her laughter, the joy that must have filled her heart, before the burdens of life took hold. I found another letter, this one more recent, written in a shaky hand. "I'm sorry," it began. "I never meant to hurt you. I was too caught up in my own pain to see yours." Tears streamed down my face as I realized how deeply she had struggled with her own demons. She had fought so hard to keep her head above water, and in her battle, she had unknowingly pushed me away. As I read her words, I felt an overwhelming sense of empathy wash over me. I wanted to reach out to her, to tell her that I understood, that her pain was valid. I had spent so many years feeling abandoned, yet here was this woman who had faced her own abandonment and had been fighting for her own survival. The realization that she had been battling her own feelings of invisibility made my heart swell with compassion. In that moment, I understood that my mother's emotional distance was not a reflection of her love for me, but rather a shield she had built to protect herself from the pain she had experienced. She had been trapped in her own cycle of suffering, and in her struggle, she had unintentionally passed down the weight of that pain to me. I began to piece together the fragments of her life, and with each revelation, I felt a sense of clarity. The letters were not just a collection of memories, they were a testament to her resilience, her strength, and her desire for connection. I realized that I had inherited her spirit, her determination to fight against the odds. As I continued reading, I discovered more about her dreams and aspirations, the things she had wanted for herself and for me. She had wanted to be a writer, to share her story with the world. "If only I could find the words," she had written. "I want to inspire others to find their voice." Those words struck a chord within me. I had spent so much of my life feeling silenced, yet here was my mother, a woman who had yearned to speak her truth. I felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility to honor her legacy. I knew that my journey was not just about healing my own wounds, but also about carrying forward her dreams. I wanted to write my own story, to share my pain and my triumphs, to inspire others who felt lost and invisible. As I closed the box, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I was no longer just a woman grappling with the pain of abandonment. I was a daughter reclaiming her mother's narrative. I was ready to confront my doctor, to demand the validation I had been denied for so long. I had discovered the strength that lay within me, and I was determined to rewrite my story. The next day, I found myself sitting in the waiting room of my doctor's office, my heart racing with a mix of fear and determination. I had rehearsed what I wanted to say, but as I sat there, I felt the familiar wave of doubt wash over me. What if he dismissed me again? What if he didn't take me seriously? But then I thought of my mother. I thought of her letters, her struggles, and the strength she had shown in her own life. I reminded myself that I was not just fighting for myself, but for her as well. I took a deep breath, reminding myself of the connection we shared, the bond that transcended time and pain. When my name was finally called, I stood up, my legs trembling slightly as I walked into the examination room. The doctor greeted me with his usual smile, but this time I wasn't here to play the role of the quiet patient. I was here to reclaim my voice. "Doctor," I began, my voice steady despite the fluttering in my chest. "I need to talk to you about something important." He looked at me with a hint of confusion, but I pressed on. "The last time I was here, you dismissed my pain as drama. But I've spent a lot of time reflecting on that moment, and I've realized that my pain is real, and it deserves to be acknowledged." I could see the surprise in his eyes as I continued. "I've spent years feeling invisible, feeling like my struggles didn't matter. But I've come to understand that my experiences are valid, and I refuse to let anyone silence me again." His expression shifted, and I could see that he was beginning to understand the gravity of my words. "I've discovered things about my mother's life that have helped me understand my own pain," I continued. "She fought her battles in silence, just as I have, but I'm no longer willing to carry that burden alone." As I spoke, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. I was finally voicing the pain that had been buried for so long, and it felt liberating. I could see the doctor processing my words, and for the first time, I felt heard. "I want to be taken seriously," I said, my voice firm. "I deserve to have my pain acknowledged, and I'm here to advocate for myself." He nodded slowly, his demeanor shifting from dismissive to attentive. "I apologize for how I made you feel," he said, his tone sincere. "Your pain is valid, and I want to help you find a way to address it." In that moment, I felt a surge of triumph. I had confronted the man who had dismissed my suffering, and I had made my voice heard. It was a pivotal moment, one that marked the beginning of my journey toward healing. As I left the office, I felt a sense of empowerment that I had never experienced before. I was no longer defined by my past. I was a woman reclaiming her story, ready to embrace the possibilities that lay ahead. I knew that my journey was far from over, but I felt hopeful. I had uncovered the truth about my mother's struggles, and in doing so, I had found a connection to her that would guide me on my path. I was ready to write my own narrative, to share my story with the world, and to inspire others who felt lost and invisible. In the days that followed, I began to write. I poured my heart onto the pages, weaving together the threads of my mother's life and my own. I wrote about the pain of abandonment, the search for validation, and the journey toward healing. With each word, I felt a sense of catharsis, a release of the emotions that had been bottled up for so long. I began to share my writings with others, and the response was overwhelming. People reached out to me, sharing their own stories of struggle and resilience. I realized that I was not alone in my pain. There were countless others who had felt the weight of invisibility, who had longed for their voices to be heard. As I connected with these individuals, I felt a sense of community forming. We were all in this together, united by our shared experiences and our desire for healing. I found strength in their stories, and in turn, I hope to offer them hope through mine. The more I wrote, the more I felt a sense of purpose. I was no longer just a woman grappling with her past. I was a storyteller, a voice for those who had been silenced. I wanted to inspire others to find their own voices, to share their pain and their triumphs with the world. And so, I continued to write, to share, and to connect. I knew that my journey was just beginning, but I felt a sense of hope that had been absent for so long. I was ready to embrace the possibilities that lay ahead, to honor my mother's legacy, and to inspire others to never give up on hope, no matter how deep the pain may run. As I reflected on my journey, I felt a sense of gratitude wash over me. I was grateful for the letters that had opened my eyes to my mother's struggles, for the strength I had discovered within myself, and for the connections I had forged with others. I knew that my story was not just mine. It was a collective narrative, one that spoke to the resilience of the human spirit. And so, I invite you, dear viewer, to join me on this journey. If my story has touched you, if you felt the weight of invisibility or the longing for validation, I encourage you to share your own experiences. Together, we can create a tapestry of hope, a community that uplifts and supports one another. Before I continue, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to know how far my story reaches, how many of us are connected through our shared struggles. As I look back on my journey, I realize that the pain I once felt has transformed into a source of strength. I am no longer defined by the silence of my past. I am a woman with a voice, ready to share my story and inspire others to do the same. If my story touched you, subscribe to the channel and share it so more people never give up on hope. Together, we can create a world where every voice is heard, where every story matters, and where healing is possible.